Hey y'all, welcome to the second episode of Relationships with DAP. We are the Community Education and Outreach Team for the Domestic Abuse Project of Delaware County, also known as DAP. I am Nicole Powell, the Community Education Manager.
Hi, my name is Veronica Lynch, and I am the Outreach Awareness Specialist.
Hi, I'm a senior at Neiman University.
And we will be your hosts today as we learn and talk about Indigenous women and their experience with domestic violence. Ready?
It's
time to get real. Hey. All right. So without further ado, let's get to it.
Yes.
All right. So fortunately, we have been awarded the opportunity to dig a little deeper in specific demographics and their access or barriers to accessing services of domestic violence, including ours. And so we have been working diligently and will continue to be doing so over the next few months and having conversations and sharing information and educating ourselves and each other around these demographics and their experience with domestic violence and how we can better provide services to them. And this month, we are highlighting Indigenous women or Native women and Alaska Native women. And so that's a big overarching term, but we want to be as inclusive as possible. And we also want to just share a disclaimer that we are not experts. We are simply educators. So we are learning along with you and learning ourselves. And so this information we'll be sharing and discussing today is simply based off of the education that we have received over a very short period of time, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Cool beans. So let's start off with a little bit of background and what we understand about the history of Native folks here living within the United States.
Ania, would you like to kick us off with anything since you did amazing work in getting this information together?
Thank you so much. I would just like to say from my understanding of the history that in the Native history, it was very rare at first, but they started with the history of the domestic violence. It basically started when they were going to boarding schools, and that's when Native women or Native children were forced to speak different languages, not forced to speak their own language, and that's basically where domestic violence stemmed from in their community, and it followed along suit throughout their life.
Right. And I think this is something that you pointed out and that we've kind of talked about before, like in the first podcast, and we'll bring it up. I think every podcast is like gender roles and gender identity and what role that plays with domestic violence. And I think from my own reading and like learning from this is that, there wasn't a hierarchy of gender. People were equal, but genders did have specific roles. Like women were mothers, they provided children, but that was a respected role. So violence against women was an issue because you were disrespecting the providers of the family. And then I guess when you bring up boarding schools, right, there's that colonization of a whole different culture coming in. And then there's these rigid gender roles where now suddenly one person's better than the other. And a way to dominate that is through violence.
Yeah, Yeah, and like you said, like this is a conversation or a focal point we'll probably have in every episode
Right.
that we discuss these kinds of things and break down what this looks like, because it looks different for everybody, but unfortunately it's very prevalent
Mhm.
in terms of how we interact with each other, how cultures interact with one another, how they thrive and how they survive. And of course, it definitely feeds very heavily into what domestic violence looks like, feels like, sounds like,
Mhm.
and more. And also, like Veronica said, Ania, since you did such great work, we will definitely allow you to take the lead on this one. Because again, we're all learning.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're closer to the education realm than we are, being a student. But I definitely enjoyed understanding more and learning more about the introduction of alcohol
Mhm.
as it relates to this enslavement and enforcement of the westernized culture,
Right.
right? So kind of share with us a lot more about what you learned from that experience and that for natives and indigenous folks.
Okay, so I think with Veronica, I'm gonna just jump on the gender roles. So I know in Native culture, like a woman took her husband's last name, and it wasn't a sign of like, them building a relationship. It was more of like ownership to them, so that in their community, everybody knew who that wife belonged to. So that's something that is definitely, I agree with you, Veronica. Like gender roles is just all everywhere, especially in the Native community. And with um, the alcohol thing, I definitely agree that that's something that I don't know how to say. That's something that people use as like a leverage in a relationship, because you can, you do things. Sometimes people make alcohol seem like, oh, it's a mistake, but
Right.
that was used another thing like the sign of abuse. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is something that, we continue to see even now with substances, is that there's these, lack of inhibitions that if it wasn't for the alcohol, those behaviors wouldn't have taken place. Um, and so I think, you do see a huge difference when there is the introduction of alcohol. Suddenly there's a spike in violence, and but it aligns with this, enforcement of Western ideals coming with it too. So I think there's obviously like a huge connection, right? It's kind of like almost like an infection coming through and forcing everyone to be different. But then also when
Yeah.
there's alcohol involved, right, there's also a numbness, and you're desensitized to violence then, because you can just easily cover it up and you start to feel good. So you can maybe you don't remember things that you did. And I think, I don't want to be speaking like out of nothing, but I do believe alcoholism is still an issue in the Indigenous community because of this, long history.
Yeah, and I mean, just even when we do our education programs and we kind of highlight the cycle of abuse,
Mm-hmm.
thereafter the power and control dynamics. But in the cycle of abuse, we tend to share that like alcohol or substance use isn't the direct cause
Mm-hmm.
of like tension building, leading to the explosion phase. However, it definitely is a major enhancer.
Right.
And so I think a lot of times we understand substance use to be like a direct cause
Mm-hmm.
of, but we also want to kind of, provide that accountability that it's not necessarily the only, reasoning behind one's behavior, but it definitely can enhance poor behavior and poor judgment in certain
Right.
circumstances, especially when it comes to domestic violence.
Exactly. And that's when, you talk about domestic violence treatment or anything, you do have to look at like the reasons for seeking power and control, even if alcohol is involved. And that might be the reason you believe that's why you act like this. You really do. There are layers to this. If you are seeking something when you are putting power and control tactics onto another person, right? Like you want something from them. And that is to
Right.
like be in charge and have that control, and it might be easier to chalk it up to, well, I was drunk, so that's why I did it. But those behaviors they're there. And so you really have to take time to go through them and discuss with yourself and reflect on, that was you, whether or not you were
Hmm.
drunk
Hmm.
when you did it.
Right. And I think, like kind of revisiting baseball and all things, we'll talk about power and control. And so like the simple definition I oftentimes share is like, domestic violence is, what are they seeking to gain and maintain, right? They're seeking to gain and maintain power and control over another individual. And just in Western culture, like that's exactly what they were doing towards Natives and the Indigenous community by enforcing this power and controlling their culture by changing their religion, their relationship dynamics, their schooling behaviors, their names, their language, like everything. And so I think that's also kind of a huge piece of it, because although domestic violence, we understand to be within like intimate partners and relatives, but what we're learning and what I think these conversations have stemmed from is the fact that this systemic power and control dynamics that are so prevalent and that, again, create those barriers of access and opportunity across the line, more than just domestic violence services, but just in general, right?
Right. Especially since this goes back to your point, Ania, that you brought up earlier with boarding schools, is that suddenly violence became a form of correcting behavior.
Right.
That wasn't, from when I've learned, like there is, families lived peacefully, right? There was harmony. That's not to say there wasn't ever any conflict, right? I think you need to be realistic, but, violence in boarding schools was the answer. If you weren't how they wanted you to behave, you were met with physical, possibly sexual and psychological abuse. And we know that America has a long history of physical and sexual abuse towards, women and, minority communities. So we have to be realistic in the long lasting effects that has on a community.
Yeah, I agree with both of you are saying. And I think a lot of the time, as I was reading and learning, a lot of the time the Native community or the Indigenous women, they wanted peace a lot in their community. However, it wasn't happening. They thought domestic violence was something that they can avoid. But like you said, it's all over. So yeah, that is definitely right.
Yeah, and again, a big piece of that in terms of like roles, and again, like this, I want to say the stealing of one's culture. They really stole
absolutely
their culture, and with that, again, is religion and the spiritual power and control piece. And I think we can all agree, when we have conversation in the community specifically, like oftentimes people are like, well, is spiritual abuse a thing? And absolutely it is. Although it's not specifically stated or outlined on a general or generic, I call it, power and control, it's definitely a thing, because even our services extend to religious communities. And unfortunately, due to the impact, or I guess the enforcement of Western culture, that dynamic changed and shifted, and unfortunately, again, fed into these gender roles and these unhealthy relationships and this unhealthy enforcement of power. Not to say that hierarchy cannot be a thing or there should not be an order, but again, when does it become unhealthy and dangerous?
Yeah. And if you think about the pain that comes along with having to reject something that brings great comfort, right? We have different religious backgrounds, right, in our group right now, but we all know that, it's tied to family, right? And you remember how good it makes you feel. And it's something to turn to when you're not sure. So to have to completely reject that and take on something that's unfamiliar, does not reflect your own experiences or how you feel, that's very confusing and heartbreaking.
It's scary.
Very scary.
I was gonna say it's
say it, girl.
I was gonna say I can only imagine what it would be like if somebody told me, I couldn't do be my own religion. I'll be like, I don't know anything else. You know what I mean? Like Veronica said, it's from your family. It's what you've grown up with. So
yeah. And I think what we have to teach, learn, and understand is, in order to enforce and gain and maintain this power and control, you first have to break somebody down, right?
Right.
And this is exactly what they're doing. This is the process that they took to break down this community, in order to quote unquote build them up in their own personal benefit, by enforcing these unhealthy, violent, scary behaviors. And is there anything else we want to? Oh yeah, let's talk about, the loss of identity that they experienced and how it was replaced by this negative experience, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah.
You can kick us off, Ania.
Okay. Like basically what I was saying before, a lot of it in their community and their history, marriage is seen more as an ownership and not as a partnership where we get the healthy part of a marriage. It's like marriage is a partnership. You do everything with your partner. In their community, it's more of like, okay, this is my wife. This is who she belongs to. And everybody has to know it. She had to follow certain rules and everything like that. So I think that is definitely a sense of ownership, and it was more of like not treating your partner as if they were equal, but more treating them as if they were property.
Okay.
Now, I have a question. Sorry, go ahead. You go.
I think I was going to ask the same thing that you're asking.
Then you do it.
I was just going to ask: is this before or after, like the colonization of Indigenous communities?
It is after. Oh, it is
great. Yeah. No, I think, that's a great point, right? That here we see the huge, theme of colonization is power and control. And, you brought up a great point with like marriage being ownership. We see that with the history of domestic violence. I was just saying that you see like a documented history of that in America, right? Where like everything in court, was even with the rule of thumb where men could legally hit their wives as long as it wasn't anything thicker than their thumb. That's something that we see. And then, we're fighting for VAWA now, the Violence Against Women Act, that's continued to be, argued against, that it's not useful.
I saw that. I was like, why are we going against this all of a sudden?
What just
happened?
Like America's long lasting documented history is that men they own their wives. And that is like colonization, like ideal. So I think it's a great point to bring up that wasn't the behaviors or thoughts until, Western ideals came in.
Yeah, and because I agree with you, Veronica, I'm glad you brought up this point. I think because when you marry somebody, basically it's their property, so they feel as though what the law back then was, it's your property, you can do what you want with it. Right. And the wives' rights were very limited. They couldn't do anything a lot of without their husband being around. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point. That's a great point.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this male dominant culture is a lot. I'll just say it that simply put, right? But I mean, it also goes to show that I would think that prior to this culture being what's the word I'm looking for? Stolen.
Yeah.
I would like to think that, like you said, there was more of a partnership in their relationships, right? And I think, fortunately, again, like this society is hopefully progressing. I don't know, this Wawa Act kind of funky, but you hope that things are progressing where we shift back to that partnership experience where you have equal voices, equal input and output for all, and that will contribute to not just the relationship, but also to just society and the community as a whole. So let us also kind of like shift to, we're already kind of actually talking about this actually. So the similarities and differences in terms of the power and control will, because one of the things that we are learning and also like to teach others is how we try to be culturally competent or humble. Yes, culturally humble and competent and aware on the individuals we service and our community. And that will be inclusive of understanding and identifying the different power and control dynamics that exist. And we're already kind of talking about it, but we also want to just preface this conversation by saying that there is a power and control wheel for every demographic. But right now, we will highlight what we have for Indigenous. So who would like to introduce it? Ania, how about you introduce the partner violence triangle that they have?
Okay. Like Nicole said, there's a power and control wheel for basically every community. But it's so interesting. The Native women, they have one that's called the Intimate Partner Violence Triangle, and it's a triangle based on all the types of abuse that they go through. So yeah, do you want to kick off, Veronica, like something that may be different, or you want me to
take it?
Okay.
Yeah, like, was there anything that stood out to you, Nia, when you were doing the research and everything? And then I'll just build off it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so one thing that stood out to me, there were two types of abuse, but we can start with the first one, ritual abuse, and it's to make their partners feel less ethical and try to stop their way of life and spirituality. Some examples of this can include the partners make prayers against their survivors, and then the partners try to use their spirituality as a masculine thing, and it's not a feminine thing. So again, with the gender roles, and
Right.
that's pretty different. And then they say like, oh, if you're on your period or you're you're on menstruation cycle, that makes you dirty. So yeah, and that's something that you don't see in an everyday power and control wheel, I guess. So I thought that was really interesting. That stood out to me. So yeah.
That's
No,
very
you're
interesting.
absolutely right. Yeah, like you
Yeah.
don't see anything. Even though that's talked about, like we have had separate conversations about like what the views on periods and like what does that mean, and how
Yeah.
people treat it. But to see it used on a tool for survivors is really interesting.
Yeah, like you're right. We have had, other conversations outside of this about what that looks like for a variety of cultures, and again, how that
Right.
has changed over time. Because like I said, we all have different religious backgrounds, and I know like biblically there's like in the Old Testament, there's some stuff that I'm personally still unclear about. I don't know everything, still learning. But it's really interesting. And I think someone too, a friend of mine who's from of another culture shared me like, you can't go into a church.
Mm,
Females can't go into, or their place of worship rather, excuse me, while menstruating. It's like, huh.
yeah.
Interesting. So, I think with that spiritual abuse again tying into that, you kind of enforce your own rituals and beliefs, or rather, interpret your belief system to enforce this power and controlling behaviors.
Right. And I think too, right now we are progressing into a society that understands that gender doesn't decide like masculinity or femininity, but periods themselves have been historically a feminine associated thing. So therefore, right, feminine people were less than, so periods were worse. And the thing about periods is that you literally you have no control over that. Like,
Yeah.
like, and that always just makes me so annoyed. It's like, well, nobody woke up asking to get a period. I mean, I did
Absolutely
in middle
not.
school. I was hyper in middle school. I was like, thank God. But nobody thinks about that now. Like,
No. You might be the only one. I'm sure you regret that thought now.
well, I remember reading, what was it? Oh, are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. She wants to get her period because all her friends had one, and that's how I felt. I was like, everyone else had their period. This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah. But also growing up in my home, like periods were something that were kind of hyped up, like, where cause I was raised Wiccan and it's all about femininity. So that was like a huge sign of it. So that was when we got our periods, our mom took our picture, like the same thing when we bought our first bras, we took a picture with our first bras. So like,
and I think that's a good thing. Like, something like that should be celebrated, since as we're talking about it, it has been demonized, literally.
right. Yeah.
And so again, shifting that perspective for it to be like, wow, you've come this far and you have a long way to go.
Right. And now we know now, like getting a period doesn't inherently make you feminine. So it's like interesting, and it's important to acknowledge like those differences. But it's like, does that change? Does that affect the power and control triangle at all? I think that's something to even think about.
Yeah, well said. And I mean, moving forward, we will definitely have individuals from each community represented on these conversations, again, because we have a lack of knowledge about much.
Yes.
And I now have like lots of questions in terms of what that looks like now and how it feels. have things changed? If not, what does that look like? And how can we, as an agency and as educators and as just human beings, support that experience, or, encourage people to, live their best life, be their best selves. As this experience, like, are the rituals still prevalent? Like, how can we support their belief system and also support their safety?
Right. Especially since we at DAP also acknowledge that domestic violence affects everyone of every gender identity and expression. But when you do the research for the Indigenous community, it is a largely gendered topic. So that's also a shift for us. So it's like we want to be inclusive of everyone, but also is that the reality in this community, that domestic violence affect both genders just equally? So it is, plenty of questions. So if anyone listening has these answers, you can always reach out to us and let us know.
Please do. Well said. Well said. What else stood out to you in terms of similarities and differences, Ania?
Another difference was the cultural abuse, which is a type of abuse where an abuser can exercise dominance over a victim who is vulnerable due to their cultural identity. So examples of this can include your partner saying, "Oh, you natives don't do this, or people don't do that." They do things like they have contests, they compete about who's more. The word that is said is Indian, who has more Indianness in them. And then they say, participating in ceremonies and then abusing their spouse right afterwards. So oh, they have let's say they go and renew their vows or something. And then right after, it's time for some domestic violence. So that's another one that definitely stood out to me.
That's not funny, but the way you said that was...
I know, I was like,
it's about time.
It's our time to... It's time to get real. It's time.
Yeah, we're putting on a show for everybody else, but once we go behind closed doors, okay, the flip is being switched. So yeah.
Right. No, I think, and that's something I have heard before about other cultures, especially when it comes to marriage and whether or not the wife is a virgin. And there's this idea that, after you get married, if she could if she wasn't beat up afterwards, that was a lack of masculinity on the husband's part. So, it was a way to assert dominance in the marriage from that point on. And again, virginity, periods, it all has to come back to whether or not you're bleeding, and that seems to be tied with women.
Yeah, I mean, as you all know, everything tends to overlap.
Oh yeah.
The power and control dynamics. You really don't have emotional or verbal abuse without, you don't have one without the other. You can have threats without emotional or mental abuse, right? You can't have using children as a tool or a form of power and control without verbal abuse. It just kind of works together. You can't have isolation without financial. It's just just all comes together. And what I did want to say, even the idea of domination, and marriage and I guess spousal requirements per se. The whole idea of, sexuality, not really sexuality, but sexual acts, most importantly, rape, and that being justifiable due to, marriage. And again, fortunately, how that, I know in, American culture, that's changed, but to be honest, it's still a modern change. Because people still think that males have the right to rape their female spouse without consequence.
Right.
And again, it's a matter of us learning and understanding what that looks like for each culture and how to respect their boundaries or lack thereof. And again, not enforcing that power and control based off of our beliefs onto what their practices are.
Right.
And I think that's really what this conversation ultimately comes to be. So yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. And it's so complicated to talk it out and piece it together because, again, we'll say it again and again, we are learning. So this is just us brainstorming here too.
That's it.
And it's also just so interesting, or I guess interesting is not the positive term that I want to use. It's the only one I can think of, but to see you said with the changes, like we hope that things have changed now, but you also have to think about the drastic things that have to happen for those things to be acknowledged as serious. And the only reason people see it as a serious thing now is because, right, the court finally recognized it as something because of the horrible things that have to happen to women in their marriages. You know, and it takes like somebody being murdered or, you know, a horrific sexual assault to finally for people to listen.
Yeah.
So even though the court says it, you have to question, like, is that the same on an interpersonal level with people?
Yeah. And now I kind of want to like talk about that though. Like, what are the legal obstacles, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to find any information about that?
I honestly did not find a lot about the legal obstacles because they have, so I know doing the research, I did find that their laws are different than like American laws. So it's kind of hard for, you know, like I don't know what to say, but like I guess American police officers or anything to help when they are going through certain situations. So that's definitely questions I would ask. Like Veronica said, if anybody has the answers, feel free to, you know, tell us. That was something I was looking into about how they happen to get help or how lawfully is it, how does that work? But that's something I would definitely have to look into to learn more
Yeah,
about.
I think this is posing more questions for us than answers for you all, which I think is great.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a big piece, you know, that again, it's a very fine line and a boundary. And, you know, we also train law enforcement officers to respond to domestic calls. And, you know, we just want to know like what line should we not cross? Should we inform them not to cross? You know, how should they respect you and your safety and your culture and without, you know, and I guess too, we want to also consider how can we work together, like with laws of natives or indigenous communities and other United States communities.
Yeah, because like I think the technicality is like the lack of jurisdiction, which, you know, I don't blame. And this is something that we've talked about before. Like I probably wouldn't want to go to US police anyway because of this huge history of abuse, you know, and I think we have to, again, we're going to acknowledge like this is the long lasting effects. You can't expect like trust to be built when it hasn't even started to be established. You know, it's again and again these instances of abuse. And then you also have to question, you know, with this history, would the police care as much if it's happening on a reservation or in a tribal community?
That's a good question.
You know,
yeah, that's definitely a good point to bring up.
Because that kind of attitude and beliefs don't kind of like just change overnight too. Those are things that are also learned and passed down.
Yeah. A lot to think about. Like my wheels are literally turning and it hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because you also have to understand too, like at a certain point, like there's only but so much that can be done. Again, recognizing those limits and boundaries and respecting them. But again, like to what end? To ensure one's safety. But we also know, again, like when we do have this conversation around safety, specifically to like safety planning, our goal is to, you know, provide that individual with the power and control they've lost in their relationship. And for us, it's a matter of asking, so what can we do to support you or help make you feel safe in this scenario, whether or not they decide to leave? Because, you know, we always say, and we'll probably say over and over again, on average, statistics state it takes someone 7 times to leave an unhealthy relationship for good.
Yeah.
And as it relates to like community ties, like you don't want to encourage anyone to leave their community because that's their support system. And part of safety planning is ensuring that you have a support system. And rebuilding that is it's not impossible, but it's very challenging.
Right. And we can't like you said, with support systems, we can't devalue the importance of emotional safety as well as physical safety. And nobody knows better about their physical safety as, you know, people who are experiencing domestic violence. You have these survival skills, and those are not something to look down upon. Like those are skills that are very important. And we're always here to hype them up and help you figure it out.
Yeah. And so, yeah, and I think I think it kind of goes without saying.
Right.
That community connection is so instrumental in ensuring their safety, survival, their emotional well-being, mental well-being, spiritual well-being, physical well-being. But I think, again, that also holds us accountable as an agency, as a service, as individuals, on how we bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And make those connections.
And we have to acknowledge too, like how much other work is being done, to prove and encourage people from every community to come and seek services. So I think, like you said, we have to take accountability and really push for it.
So how can we do that? What are we looking to do? What steps are we? I know we're taking steps. Like this is a start. The conversation is a start. But what do we do?
You want to
go ahead?
Okay. So I think you guys tied it together, basically educating. So as DAB, we definitely can, have staff educate themselves on supporting our Native survivors. We can post webinars on our website and share with the we can complete them. And we should also be promoting and celebrating the different cultures of clients that we service. And so that they feel as though they are represented in our agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a matter of like continuing to reflect on what we're doing and, always striving to be better, and we're open to feedback. So if anyone listening to this and you realize everything that is wrong, please let us know.
Yes. We are not adverse to constructive criticism. We'll take it. We are learning. Right. So can we also highlight the resource that we gained from this conversation and this learning experience and what we're looking to promote? Well, we already talked about the promotion, but the resources that we like to share.
So the resources that we would like to share is the NIWRC, which is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And it is a Native-led nonprofit organization dedicated to ending violence against Native American women and children. And their mission is to provide national leadership to end violence against American Indian, Alaskan Natives, and Native Hawaiian women by supporting culturally grounded grassroots and advocacy. Yeah. And another is that is the Strong Hearts Native Helpline, and it's a 24-hour confidential and anonymous domestic dating sexual hotline for Indigenous, and just to support and advocate for anyone who may need help. So
awesome. And we'll have that number posted with the episode and everything as well. But for anyone listening, could you read out that number, Ania? If I'm putting you on the spot too.
Hold on. It's linked. Hold on. I have to open the link.
I will say though, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, I actually attended a webinar training series with them recently regarding domestic violence and the correlation with TBIs or traumatic brain injuries. Yeah. And it was pretty good. So it's definitely a resource to connect to for other things, but especially understanding and educating around Indigenous women and their experience with domestic violence. So it's a great resource to connect to.
And they have their library on their website as well. So you can always check that out on the website. You want to tell the number?
And it's 315-478-0000.
Perfect. Thank you. And our 24/7 hotline is 610-565-4590.
Smooth. So we thank you once again for joining us for another episode of Real Relationships with DAP. Catch us again in 2 weeks. We will be discussing other forms of how domestic violence is seen in pop culture. Please follow and subscribe at DAPDelCo on all social media platforms, or check out our website for more information. And once again, for any additional support for you or someone you may know who is experiencing an unhealthy relationship, please feel free to contact our 24/7 hotline. You might get any one of us, but a trained advocate will always answer at 610-565-4590. And please do not forget to
keep it real.
Hey.
Yeah.